All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for making some time today. I know everybody's very, very busy, so I appreciate you carving out a little time to hop on this webinar. The title, as you can see, is The Next Equifax. Could it be one of your clients? And a lot of folks on the call today are familiar with Gilware and have been partners of ours for years. Others are a little new to the Gilware family of businesses. So we're going to do a little bit of background today into who Gilware is, but then also turn it over to one of my business partners, Nathan Little, who will dive into some extremely valuable use cases that go through some data breaches that we've actually been part of and done some investigations on. And I think they accomplish a lot of things for IT providers. One, they highlight just the risks that exist today out there, the type of threats that are out there. I also think that it hammers home the point that it's not just the large multinational companies like Equifax that are getting impacted by data breaches. It's small companies, small CPAs, small financial firms that are being targeted. And as IT providers, I think it's valuable for you to hear some of these stories. And then, of course, also let you know that Gilware is here to help. So with that, I want to go ahead and get started. Again, Scott Holowinski, CEO of Gilware Digital Forensics and president of Gilware Incorporated. All part of the same company, just slightly different names and ownership groups. With me today, again, is Nathan Little. Nathan is here next to me. We're going to keep this somewhat informal. But Nathan's going to be kind of my technical arm here today. He's one of our lead investigators, understands this stuff like the back of his hand. And the two particular use cases that we're going to cover today, Nathan actually worked on and led the teams who investigated those. All right, with that, what I hope you guys learned today. One, who is Gilware? Again, some of the folks on the call on the webinar today are new to Gilware, so I do want to at least explain who we are and what we do. What incident response is, it's data breaches. You know, incident response is a term that's getting thrown around a lot these days, but what is it? What types of activities and investigations do we perform? From there, we're going to dive into some real-world data breach examples. Again, we have two use cases. They actually came to our lab that we worked on. One of many, or two of many, that we've worked on over the last couple of years. But I think they highlight, again, some of the most common types of breaches that we're seeing specifically in the small and medium-sized business world. So we're going to go through in detail a couple of those breaches. From there, how Gilware can help clients dealing with a data breach. Your clients, obviously, we're here to help, and I walk through kind of the types of services that we're able to provide and why those services can be valuable. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Gilware's Incident Response Partner Program. You as our partners, our boots on the ground, how can you guys work with us to help your clients? And obviously make sure that it's financially beneficial to you as well. And I'll finish up by just kind of going through how our partner program works. Quick history of Gilware. I'll cruise through this because I do think a lot of the folks on the call today are familiar with us. We were founded in 2003. My partners and I started the business soon after graduating from University of Wisconsin here in Madison. We perform about 15,000 data recoveries every year. Data recovery is still a very big part of what we do. Although there's great backup solutions out there, people still find ways to lose data. And it's not always because it's a hard drive that fails. Oftentimes it's a user error, a large VMware server. They're upgrading it and poof, something goes wrong and all their data disappears. So data recovery is still a big part of what we do. In 2006, we founded Gilware Data Services. Some of you may have been partners with us in the past on the backup side of our business, which was the Gilware Data Services brand. We actually sold that business to StorageCraft Technology Corporation a little over a year and a half ago. And then we founded Gilware Digital Forensics. So Gilware Digital Forensics is the newest part of what we're doing. We have always been involved in digital forensics and incident response activities, but mainly as the technical assets behind the scenes. And quite honestly, we got a little tired of other people getting all the credit for the work we were doing, and decided to go out and form our own digital forensics company. In order to do that, we brought in this person, Cindy Murphy, to be the president of Gilware Digital Forensics. She is a world-renowned digital forensics investigator, an incredible woman. Has led here in Wisconsin the development of digital forensics activities and departments, both here in Madison as well as the greater state of Wisconsin. She has testified in many different cases and teaches digital forensics courses all over the world. We're very lucky to have her. We've known Cindy from back in the day. She used to use us and our data recovery services, and we're lucky enough, as she was getting ready to move on from law enforcement, to bring her on to build out our digital forensics service business. So we're very lucky to have her on our team. All right, so that's kind of the background information. Now let's dive into why all of you joined the call today, and that's to talk about data breaches and incident response. And everybody has heard the scary statistics that are thrown out in terms of what a single data breach event can cost a company. Recent Ponemon Institute research showed that in 2017, the average organization lost $7.35 million as a result of a single data breach. And what I oftentimes will hear in response to that is, yeah, but these statistics come from large multinational companies. When it comes to small and medium-sized businesses, the impact is obviously far less, and that is true, but it's all relative. A very simple example here that I like to use is taking aside the $7.35 million, the total cost, and looking at what the average cost per record stolen is. Typically, they put a number here in the U.S., and it changes depending on where you're located, at about $225 per record. So if you take that number and look at even a smallish accounting firm or financial firm or law firm that has, let's say, 1,000 clients, you're still looking at $225,000 of potential damage from a single event. And for a small and medium-sized business, that's a big number. The factors that people oftentimes overlook when they're looking at the total cost of a data breach event are things like the things that are more difficult to quantify. What is a customer worth to you, and brand reputation. The fact that they need to employ incident response services like Gilware's, or legal fees associated with a breach. As we'll show in a couple of our case studies, there are obligations depending on what type of regulatory environment you exist, whether you're a financial firm, a law firm, a healthcare facility. You have reporting obligations that you must fulfill when a breach happens. And as we'll show in one of our cases, sometimes that means you have to file a notification in every state you do business. So as you can imagine, these costs can skyrocket pretty quickly. So yes, $7.35 million is maybe not the cost to everybody, but even for a small or medium-sized business, the cost of even a single data breach can be pretty significant when you take all these factors into account. All right, what I want to do now is dive a little deeper into the types of services that Gilware provides, and more specifically, how do we go about responding to a data breach event? And there's really 5 main steps that are important. The first one, as you're going to see in a couple of the case studies that Nathan reviews, the first one is take the breach seriously and seek professional help immediately. As we'll show, at least in the second use case that we're going to go through, a case study that we have, they acted very slowly, and because of that, the breach was much, much worse than it could have been. In fact, it didn't even need to happen at all had they acted at the first signs that something may have been awry. So making sure that you take it seriously. If you have a client that reaches out to you and says, hey, there's some funny stuff going on here, have a serious conversation with them about Is this, what type of data do you have? What could have potentially happened? Was it personal identifiable information, financial information? And if they say yes to any of those, give us a call. Let us have a conversation with the client. And worst case, we tell them, you know what, everything sounds fine. Move on. But more likely than not, we're going to say, hey, let us spend a little time digging in and let's see what happened. So that's step one. Step two is we're going to get in there, and if we identify that there is likelihood that something happened, we are going to collect and preserve the electronic evidence related to the breach. So we're going to go in, if it's a server, we're going to get an image of the server. If the server can't get shut down, if they have backups, we can work off of backups. If it's phones, if it's laptops, whatever could have been part of the breach, we're going to collect that information and preserve it. Very, very important step. From there, we're going to identify the data that was accessed or exposed. Was it financial information, social security information, anything related to credit cards? Regardless, we're going to identify what was accessed, and in particular, what was sensitive or critically sensitive that was accessed. And then finally, what systems and applications were impacted. Was it Office 365 accounts, email servers, processing, credit card processing information, whatever it might be, we're going to identify and just try and get a lay of the land of what happened. From there, we're going to start to dive into the data that we collected and figure out how the breach occurred. Was it an email phishing campaign, social engineering? Something that people don't think about, was it internal misconduct? Something like 50% of all data breaches occur because of some type of internal threat. It could have been a disgruntled employee. It could have been an employee looking to gain leverage somehow, either financially or in their career, that resulted in a data breach. So it's important to look both externally and as well as internally to see if it could have started inside the walls of that company. And then finally, most important, is reporting on the findings. One, to satisfy any legal or regulatory obligations. Again, the laws surrounding breach notification are evolving and getting much more aggressive, and oftentimes they are specific to each state. There's a lot of work trying to be done right now to come together and find a standard that applies across all the states. But for right now, if you have breaches or you do business in 46 different states, you're going to have to do notifications in all 46. And then obviously making sure that we're reporting, figuring out what happened so that we can prevent future data breaches and incidents from happening. So those are the 5 basic steps. As you can imagine, within each one of those, there's many miniature steps or smaller steps that we take. But these are the 5 basic steps in how we go about responding to a data breach. Something that's important to mention, since obviously we, at this point in time, only have one location here in Madison. That may be changing over the next year or two. The vast majority of this work we can do remotely, either going in and getting images or working off of backups of servers, or having folks send us the actual gear, get the images, and then send them back. So the fact that we're not, potentially in your neck of the woods is not a problem when it comes to responding to data breaches. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan. We're going to switch seats here. So my head will go away and Nathan's will insert. And he will go through the couple case studies that we have. And they're fairly involved. And the second one more so than the first. So we're actually going to go through the second breach because it's a very interesting one, probably twice in 2 slightly different manners. So pay attention. At the end, we are going to have time, hopefully, for some Q&A. So feel free to use the box over here, depending on what side you're on, to ask some questions, and we'll go through those at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nathan.
All right, hi everyone. So first, a couple of things to touch on the last slide. One of the most important things with a data breach is, like Scott touched on, kind of preserving the evidence. And one of the problems with data breaches, sometimes when you detect that it happened, you may already be 15, 30, 40 days out. And as you know, a lot of your logs, especially email logs, depending on how you have it configured, are going to roll over after a certain amount of time. So your systems may be, not doing you a favor when they roll over your logs and get rid of some data. And you'll actually see that in case study number 2. But we'll start with case study number 1, a pretty classic data breach case. So what happened? Our client was a CPA firm. They were a fairly large firm, but most of their tax returns were done by remote CPAs. So to make it easy for them, their IT provider opened up an RDP port in their firewall, and they didn't have VPN. So the only thing protecting access to their systems were relying on the usernames and passwords that third-party clients set up. So obviously, most of you know that having an open RDP port is bad practice. It's something that should almost never be done, even if it's limited to access from a specific IP. Because as you'll see in this case, it's pretty likely that the remote CPA's computer was compromised. And if that's the case, limiting it to that specific person's IP isn't going to help you at all. So to dive in, this case, on April 1st, 2017, you'll notice a few weeks before taxes are due, at 10:15 at night, we'll call this person Jane or John Doe. The user account is compromised from an IP address that geolocated to Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, after that point, regular unauthorized access happens from all around the world. Foreign countries, U.S. IP addresses. It's unknown if it was one actor or multiple people purchase access to this compromised system. So that went on for a few weeks. So the end result, the disaster that happened for our client, was completed tax returns in unencrypted PDFs. So tax returns ready to file for over 100 clients were stolen and fraudulently filed with fake addresses or fake accounts to direct deposit refunds in. So I don't have an exact number on how much money and refunds were stolen, but it was stolen for 100 different clients. Social security numbers and private information stolen for 300 additional clients, which doesn't sound like a ton, but when those clients are spread out all around the country, and you're a small CPA firm, that's pretty detrimental to your business and your reputation. So some of the technical details, I mentioned a few of these earlier, but the account that was compromised without a single failed login attempt, which I know what the password was and I won't tell you, and it's not something that somebody would guess in one shot. Maybe hundreds of thousands of attempts they could guess it, but not one shot. So whoever was the first intruder to this system, compromised that user's password somehow and knew exactly what user account and what password they were going to log into. And the reason this is important to mention is a lot of IT providers will set up, I want a notification anytime there's failed access for anywhere, because they think, okay, somebody may be trying to brute force, but there's no way that they get it on the first time. I'll get hundreds of thousands of notifications of failed login attempts, and I'll shut down the connection, and everything will be saved. But that sort of defense falls down when somebody knows the credentials to maliciously access, whether they phished the credentials, they contacted this employee to purchase the credentials, or this employee, was the malicious actor. That's not what we expect in this case, but those kind of things can happen. So after first access on the machine, looking at the user assist files, which, on any Windows machine, user assist artifacts will track recent programs and executables. that are launched. So the first thing, a lot of you are probably familiar with it. It's in the news and in IT documentation all the time, but is Mimikatz. And in this situation, it was used to extract plain text passwords from the Windows system. So Jane Doe's account was compromised, but once they were on this computer, they wanted to compromise other accounts. Typically that's the first step. Collect as many credentials as you can to get as far into the system as you can. So at this point, a single Windows workstation is compromised through an OpenRDP port, and the account of Jane Doe is logged in. And also, unfortunately, she's an admin of the computer, so you can do anything with the computer and any attached resources. The next thing after extracting some plain text passwords for other users is RDP conf.exe is run. This is an open source utility that can be used to enable concurrent RDP sessions on consumer grade Windows systems. So typically you're all familiar with it, but if you RDP into your computer and somebody's currently logged in, it'll kick them off. Obviously that would be a huge red flag if I was remoted into the system and I kept getting kicked off by malicious access. So that's usually the first thing we see people do in compromised RDP situations, is make sure that not only can they get in without notifying, but they can sell this access to however many hundreds of other malicious actors, and they can all be doing malicious things at the same time, which makes the negative impacts greater and harder to track down who's actually doing what. So after April, I believe I said April 1st was the date of first access. So a couple of days later, after they've probably transferred and sold this access to whoever else, on the 3rd, towards the end of the workday, compression of all of their TurboTax files, which are actually stored on a share. So this user had access to all of the TurboTax files for our client, the CPA firm's clients. So everyone's 2016 tax files, the ones that are about to be filed in 2017. So we can see that periodically zip files are created and transferred using SendSpace, which is, some of you may be familiar. SendSpace is a legitimate file sharing piece of software, but because of some intricacies of it and it being a little bit less secure and a little bit less likely to comply with subpoenas and that sort of thing, it's frequently used to not only distribute malware, but exfiltrate data from systems. So each night, the deleted web browser history that we were able to carve from the system, it may have been a private browsing session, it may have just been deleted, but we were able to carve the text of the URLs from the free space. We can see that these zip files are being uploaded each night. So we needed to find out what was in these zip files. So we used some different forensic artifacts, such as link files, LNK files, which are just, they're created whenever a user accesses a file, and that's what Windows uses to give you shortcuts to your most recently accessed files. Like I said, we used the internet history. We carved the NTFS, the Windows file system metadata, to look for deleted MFT entries. And deleted MFT entries are what actually points to the files themselves that are deleted. And in this case, we were after the deleted.zip files to try and figure out who was affected. So we found some deleted archives with their name, because we have to carve the MFT metadata to find the file's name, as well as some other NTFS artifacts. But we can also just do, a lot of you are familiar with file carving, or just finding raw files out in space. You lose the file names, but you can still look at the contents. So I won't dive too deep into that, but we found, about a dozen zip files that were used to frequently transfer files to the SendSpace. Now, SendSpace, with their free account, which is most often the maliciously used one, has a 300 megabyte upload limit. So that's why multiple zip files were used. And it also avoids detection. If you upload a 5 gigabyte, a 10 gigabyte zip file, that may set off some firewall notifications. A 300 megabyte zip file usually flies pretty under the radar depending on the system. So, I didn't go too deep into the details of the case, but the main takeaways are, because of this breach, the CPA was required to notify 1,100 clients that their information was taken. But because we at Gilware were able to recover the actual zip files using the internet history, we have a list of zip files that were transferred. Using the recovered deleted zip files, we know the contents of those zip files that were transferred. We were able to limit the amount of clients that they actually had to notify by narrowing the scope of their breach. So that saved them, by not having to notify 70, 75%, whatever it may be, of their clients, which certainly, CPA is a pretty competitive industry, helped them out a lot. They also knew exactly what happened, how to stop it in the future. And then related to that, most people know this, but unfortunately, open RDP ports with simple passwords are probably the most common breach we see, especially for small businesses with lower IT budgets that may not have the proper systems in place. So if you do have a client that needs remote access to the computer, if they're on a really low budget, TeamViewer and things like that are a good option. But the proper way to do it, and IT providers always offer this to their clients, but sometimes they reject it. But the important thing is to not let them reject it and insist that you don't open the RDP port, but instead they spend the money to have you set up a proper VPN with two-factor authentication to limit who can access the systems. The two-factor authentication is important because even VPN credentials are phishable. Any credentials are phishable, and although phishing schemes are getting more and more advanced, most of them do not take into account two-factor authentication yet. And of course, don't reuse any passwords. In this case, this user's password may have been phished for a personal Gmail account. And once they were identified as a successfully phished target, they probably looked into what other systems or where she may have worked and what else they may have been able to access. So that's kind of the gist of this case, and I'll get into the next one, which is a little bit more interesting. So I know I kind of talked a lot and didn't have a lot of images to show, but I'll check to see if Scott has anything.
I don't think so. I think the main thing to remember is that, as Nathan kind of mentioned, with the types of services that we offer, incident response services, they're obviously not free, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's money well spent. In this particular case, there were 1,100 clients that were impacted, but there were more than 4,000 of their clients that weren't. And as you can imagine, when it comes to CPA, you're dealing with people's finances. How many of these 1,100 clients that were impacted stuck with this CPA? We don't obviously have that information, but I think common sense would tell us that it's safe to say that a decent number probably said, you know what, I'm going to move on to something else. So by using incident response services, we were able to stop the breach, make sure it doesn't happen again, but ultimately limit the exposure that they had to their brand within their community. They're a CPA that's a decent size, but the city they operated in isn't huge. So the brand that they had was really important to protect. The next one that Nathan's going to go through is more involved and fairly interesting. Before we do that, I just want to make sure that everybody is still with us. We're not having any issues with audio. If you have any issues, feel free to shoot us a chat. This case study is an Office 365 phishing attack. And again, we're going to go through this one in kind of two different formats. One is this kind of the same as we just did with the last one, but we're also going to jump over to our actual report that we produced, and it shows the actual emails that were used to phish the information. So the exact content and even the fonts that they used, because this one was very sophisticated and very well done. A lot of times these attacks come from outside the United States, but we feel that because of how well this one was done, the way that the language they used was so spot on that this one may have actually occurred from within the US. So with that, I'll let kind of Nathan dive in again.
All right, so like Scott said, and as opposed to the last one, which was the OpenRDP port attack, which has been, around forever and is extremely common, the Office 365, with more and more organizations, putting everything to Office 365 because it's usually cheaper, more convenient, and it has a lot of other benefits. This Office 365 type of attack, and email attacks in general, have been common, but Office 365 accounts as a whole, attacks on them are becoming more and more common, especially last year as one of the most frequent incident response type cases we've worked. So in our case, it was another phishing attack, which is the two cases that we're doing. It's no coincidence that they were both phishing attacks. Most organizations that are targeted, phishing is the easiest way to successfully gain access because to most systems, it appears like legitimate access. And there's, like I touched on earlier, there's no failed login attempts or anything to throw red flags. So in our case, for this Office 365 account, it was a financial advisor, an investment firm, a decent sized firm. The account that was phished was one of the most commonly used emails of the organization, and it also happened to be an admin for the organization. So once the account username and password for this account were successfully phished, the attacker logged in and created a forwarding rule for the two most active email accounts in the organization. So this person either had their targets picked out or they monitored the emails going back and forth for long enough that they knew that they wanted to set up a forwarding rule on these two specific people rather than everyone to avoid detection and get the most out of their intrusion. So the emails were set up to be forwarded to a malicious Gmail account. There was also an outbox rule to delete the forwarded emails so that if somebody was poking around in their sent emails, they wouldn't see all of these emails being sent to a malicious Gmail account. So the end result, what happened because of this, is months later after the initial intrusion, the attacker found some forwarded emails that were tempting enough to act upon, and a social engineering attack was conducted on one of the investment firm's clients, and it was used to jump in the middle of an exchange between the investment firm's employee and the client about where and how to transfer money and intercept effectively a wire transfer of $25,000. So the timeline of events is really interesting in this case because there's so many points where the negative effects of this attack could have been ended and it wouldn't have gone any further. And most of that, has to do with training and awareness. So on September 9th, 2017, we'll call it Jeff's computer. That is not his real name. That is the first evidence that Jeff's account was compromised. And the reason we know that is the client didn't even actually indicate this to me, but they gave me admin access to their Office 365 account. And this is September 9th is a month previous to the timeline they asked me to look at. They actually asked me to start October 1st. But we always look a little bit back because usually people underestimate and don't go back far enough to when they think the attack started. And I saw an email from one of Jeff's banks where they said, Jeff, we received an email from you requesting a transfer to this bank in Canada. Not super unusual for you, but it's never a bank we've transferred to before. We just want to make sure that this is legitimate. And he said, no, that wasn't me. So the employee at the bank actually took it to their security specialist. They looked at the email headers and said, Jeff, this came from your Office 365 account. It didn't come from your IP address specifically, but someone has credentials to your email address. You should change those immediately. So that failed to happen. The password wasn't changed. So there's kind of the first step where the client should have changed their password. And some of the effects of this case probably would have still happened, but a lot of them wouldn't. So on October 5th, nearly a month after potential first compromise, obviously the client's credentials could have been compromised long before September 9th, but on October 5th, an email was sent out to 600 of Jeff's clients. The email was written in a pretty common way that Jeff would address his clients. He was usually pretty brief. We'll see the email later on, I believe, but the email was basically this, like some important information for you to review. An encrypted PDF is attached, which is a common way that Jeff would exchange documents with his clients, encrypted PDFs, encrypted Excel spreadsheets. Unfortunately, about 20 of those people responded with, Jeff, I've entered every email and password I can think of. I can't unlock this document. I also entered my phone number that it asked for. I can't get into it. Can you send it in a different format? So 20 people, probably multiple email and password for each client, were successfully phished by that attack. And multiple people reached out to Jeff and said, hey, I think your account's being spoofed or hacked. It sent me this malicious email. But a lot of people did fall for it. So after that, the password for Jeff's account is changed. The IT provider reaches out to him and he changes the password. So in theory, after that, the malicious actor no longer has direct access to the Office 365 instance. And there's some other pieces of evidence that we use to believe that that was true, fortunately, but you'll see that the damage isn't quite done yet. So on 10/10, the IT provider discovered a forwarding rule on Jeff's Office 365 email account. And this was the forwarding rule that forwarded all of his inbound emails to a malicious Gmail account. So we're already a month after, exactly one day over a month after initial compromise. So at minimum, a month of Jeff's emails have been compromised and forwarded. And these emails contained account numbers and all sorts of very sensitive client information, mostly dealing with financials. So on December 28th, I mentioned that the account that was compromised was an admin account. On December 28th, a significant amount of time after the original compromise, emails from Sue, another employee at the firm, were used to socially engineer the wire transfer that I mentioned of $25,000. Again, a month after that, the forwarding rule was found also on Sue's account. So we're assuming that the forwarding rules, they were both to the same malicious Gmail account. They were both probably put in place somewhere in September, possibly October, and we don't know exactly when they were put in place. And I could touch on it later, but I'll just touch on it now. I mentioned how important it is to preserve logs and make sure that your system is logging important information. In this case, we were brought in after January 24th. This should actually be 2018. So we were brought in significantly after the original breach occurred, and the email trace logs on their account only went back 90 days. So we could only identify when we ran the email trace that the forwarding rules were in place for both Sue and Jeff's account as of the end of October. But it's obvious that they were in place before then, because on October 10th, the forwarding rule for Jeff's account was found. So the other thing that we don't know exactly when the forwarding rules are put in place, and if you take away one thing about Office 365 from this conversation, is that the admin audit logs of Office 365 are extremely helpful. But in a default Office 365 account, admin audit logging isn't enabled. And what admin audit logging does is it logs every admin action, every SharePoint file access. It's extremely helpful in breaches, but it only logs after you've enabled it. So I enabled it for this client, but previous to that, while they've been running Office 365 for 2 years, it hadn't been enabled. So that made this investigation take a lot longer, and the results were much less concrete. So if you have any Office 365 clients out there that don't have the admin logging enabled, I recommend today logging into an admin account, going to the security settings, clicking on admin login auditing, and enabling it. It usually takes about 2 days before logs start to show up. But then if you go back in, you can see the logs and you can start to create alerts. Forwarding rules is a common attack, so I recommend creating an alert anytime a forwarding rule is set up. But so now we can dig into this a little bit more, and I'll pull up the actual report here that we generated for the client.
Yep.
So it's up there, hopefully you can see it. A lot of this is for the lawyer and the legal obligations, because they did have to notify this breach, and I believe it was about 46 states. So what we did in this case, when we were brought in, they didn't know what was happening. They knew that one of their clients just got $25,000 stolen from them. And I say just, it happened a month before they brought us in. They knew that happened. They knew that they had this incident with the forwarding rule back in October, and they knew they just discovered a new forwarding rule. So because the logs weren't enabled, they had no idea, is somebody inside of our firewall persistently and just did the same thing to a different user that they did back in October? Was this enabled at the same time and was missed by the IT provider when the IT provider disabled the forwarding rule? They were pretty concerned, because obviously this was a huge impact. They had 4 or 5 months of emails that were forwarded to this malicious actor. And the way this company worked, Sue, whatever names we used, 2 people, Jeff and Sue, I think we used, they worked closely together. Sue would initiate trades for Jeff. So every trade they made would have a client's account number going back and forth between 2 of them, and it was sent to Sue, and she had the forwarding rule for 2 months, or 5 months, or whatever it may be, from September to end of January 2018. So this was obviously something they were very concerned about, and so they brought in us to figure out, how did this happen? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? So they gave us every computer that they thought had ever accessed these 2 accounts. So it was 7 devices and 1 device that contained some backups of Jeff's computer. But what I want to kind of touch on, this is a more detailed aspect of the timeline. Here's about the email that went through. There's some other details in here, but here is the email that was sent from Jeff's account to 600 so clients.
Why don't you zoom in a little bit, Nathan, so it's big enough on everybody's screen? There you go.
So here's the malicious PDF. To most of us, this looks like an obvious phishing attack, but unfortunately, 99% of the world, even more, are not IT providers, and they can't identify phishing attacks as quickly. The email address was not spoofed. It was a legitimate email from his account. It's the type of email that he sends to clients all the time. With the title is redacted here, but then it ends in investment.pdf. It was a pretty common thing he would send to these clients. It would be about an investment opportunity or something, and they would unlock it with a predetermined set of credentials. And a decent amount of people fell for it. So that's kind of the first blatantly malicious, successful thing that this actor did. That email was sent legitimately from his Office 365 account from an IP address that geolocated to Nigeria, but did go through legitimate Outlook servers. It wasn't spoofed. So as we go down here, some more details on the events and the evidence that was found. But what I want to go through is the actual emails that were sent to the client. Because that forwarding rule was in place and the malicious actor had so much insight into the context of how Sue sent emails and how she communicated with clients and what clients she was currently communicating with. So on December 27th, 2017, there was an email. This is from Sue to another person who's we'll call them the victim in this situation. That's who had the $25,000 stolen from them, where they've been going back and forth about needing $25,000 deposited into the Schwab account to invest. So Sue says to the victim, "Are you able to mail the check sometime the next week or so?" So what's obviously redacted here is Sue's email signature, but this black box is her legitimate email signature. This email was sent from her. She authenticated it. She said, "Yeah, that was definitely me." So this is, although redacted, an example of the context of the situation and a real email sent by Sue. So this is the response from our victim. He says, "I'll drop off the check next Wednesday. I'm in Colorado until the 2nd. Thanks," his email signature. So the victim says that they're in Colorado until the 2nd. So this email, the forwarding rule was still in place here. This email was forwarded to our malicious actor, the intruder. And then here, outlined in red, is our first email that is illegitimate. This did not come from Sue. But when you look at it, the font and the color of the text is the same thing that she's used for all previous emails. It's very much looks legitimate. It's well spoofed. It comes from a United States IP address. It appears to most people that it would have come from her account. So she says, "I'm really sorry for this rush," which she often started emails with apologizing. An email you haven't seen, she started in exactly this way, and that's where this context came from. She's said this exact line: "I've just got off the phone with Schwab before." So this, to someone who's on vacation in Colorado, this probably looks pretty legitimate. "They want the transfer to be done ASAP. Could you please transfer $25,000 from JPM Savings to Wells Fargo, and we will write the check ourselves. Please let us know if I should send you the Wells Fargo trust account for you to wire the funds into." So the attacker is asking for acknowledgement of this email, which makes it appear even more legitimate, because most of the time attackers, just kind of shotgun approach, just, "Hey, Schwab wants the transfer done immediately. Here's the account, send it over right away." But this attacker is, based on the way it's written, we think a native English speaker. It's kind of irrelevant at this point. But our victim responds, "Yes, you can send the information and I'll transfer the money today." So obviously this is when our attacker's eyes really light up and know that he's got this guy hook, line, and sinker and can probably have him transfer money anywhere into the world. Could probably ask for more money right now if he really wanted to. So here's the email that has the account not owned by our client using a fake name, fake LLP here, but they give the Wells Fargo routing number and account number. It has Sue's legitimate email signature, appears just as legitimate as anything else. Please send me the wire reference number as soon as the wire initiated. Message reference is his actual, account number with this investment firm. Everything seems so legitimate because this forwarding rule was in place so long, and this attacker had all of the context of every email that Sue's received. So that's what happened. And, months later, the victim reached out and said, hey, whatever happened with that transfer I sent, I didn't hear from you. And because the forwarded emails were deleted and these emails weren't actually sent from Sue's message email account, it was unknown to everyone until months later. So by the time we were brought in, we tracked down the entire timeline, figured out what was affected. And because of the way this Office 365 account was set up and how late we were brought in and the logs weren't preserved, which is why preserving and dumping logs, even if you don't think you need them, and by dumping, I don't mean getting rid of, I mean, dumping them to some sort of media, is so important. We were left with the only thing that we could say is that, someone had complete access to this Office 365 account for likely a month. And after that was forwarded all emails to Sue's account for about 4 months. So I can let Scott jump in on the key takeaways here.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathan. So yeah, we're wrapping up here. I appreciate everybody hanging with us. Key takeaways, the direct financial damages for this financial firm were about $125,000. That's at least what we know today. There's significant collateral financial damage as a result of lost clients as part of this breach. I hit on this earlier that the investment firm had clients in 46 different states, which meant they had to file 46 breach notifications all across the country, which, as you can imagine, the legal fees associated with doing that are fairly significant. A key takeaway is the failure to seek professional incident response services immediately meant that they needed to notify clients at actually 3 different points. At the end of the day, this company simply didn't fully understand the gravity of that initial breach. When the bank reached out to him and said, hey, you should change your password, somebody's sending emails on your behalf. They just didn't take it seriously. And as Nathan kind of hit on, unfortunately, a lack of training. These are financial advisors. They're not technical by nature, and they just didn't understand what was going on. And had they sought professional help early on, a lot of this, if not all of it, could have been avoided. In red here, we have just a couple key takeaways for our IT folks on the call here. Have separate logins for your user accounts and your admin accounts. In this case, they were one and the same, which meant once his personal account was phished, they had admin access to go in and set up those forwarding rules and send emails on their behalf, which was obviously the beginning of all of this. Always use 2-factor authentication. That's kind of a no-brainer today. Enable admin audit logging, which is included. It's not an extra fee in Office 365, as Nathan mentioned, but it is not on by default. So if you're setting up Office 365 for your clients, please go in and set that up and make sure it's enabled. And then finally, when a breach occurs, call professionals. Get us involved, even if it's just for a consultation. We're more than happy to get on the call and talk through what's going on and give an assessment of what their risk is and whether or not it makes sense to dig deeper. With that, we're pretty much at the end. I really was hoping to get some time for questions. Actually, it doesn't look like we have any right now. So what I will do here is, let me just move this off the screen so you guys can see this. Here's the contact information for Nathan and I. Please feel free to email us at our email address is here if you have follow-on questions. If you have a client that is experiencing a breach or has a breach that comes up in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out to Nathan and I. Again, we're more than happy to do a consultation, probably Nathan more than me, and walk through what they're dealing with. And of course, if you have any questions about our partner programs, feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to respond to emails or hop on a phone call if necessary. So thanks for your time. Nathan, thanks you for your time.
Thanks.
And hope everybody found it useful. And we'll be doing more of these. I think the use cases are valuable for our IT providers. Gives you some heads up on terms of what types of attacks are happening out there and keeps you guys on your toes. So thanks for your business over the years. If you're new to the Gilware family, I hope to work with you in the future. And have a great rest of your week. Bye.